Good morning everyone and welcome to an uncharacteristically sunny, bright, blue-skied England for a November morning. Now, one of the interesting things about being a car YouTuber is that you're constantly being offered lovely, different, unusual and interesting cars to drive. And sometimes they might be cars that you've never ever considered or perhaps even forgot existed. And that's the case with today's car. This VW Up GTI. Now, VW are a little bit confusing when it comes to what they think this car actually is. You see, if you look at all the marketing for when the car came out, they're basically trying to pretend that this is basically a modern incarnation of the Mark I Golf. Now, here's the funny thing. I've never really been a massive Golf fan, and I know it's basically sacrilege to some people, but a Mark I Golf just doesn't do anything for me at all. And VW don't make things any better for themselves if you go on their website, because they'll try and call this the people's supercar. Look, VW, I'm sure this car is many things. It's not a supercar. Please don't even use the word. However, as a super mini, well, it could do well. So let's go through some of the basics. Now, one of these will set you back about £14,000. That is a couple of grand cheaper than an entry-level Abarth 595. It is a bit down on power. So this is a 1 litre 3-cylinder turbo petrol producing 115 horsepower and about 150 or thereabouts pound-foot of torque, or 200 newton meters if you prefer to think of it that way. Now, if you like the styling, that's good. If you don't, that's bad, because the options list is pretty small. There's a choice of a few colours, none of which are particularly exciting. Now, I'm not generally a fan of white cars, but actually I think this could be the best colour for it. It's a small car and it's got some fairly big sections of black, which help make the white pop a little bit, and you got the odd little red stripe as well as classic GTI motif. Now, the flies are an optional extra, and they've only joined us for today. This shows you what a nice sunny day it is, because they are everywhere. You're not short of GTI badges, and this car, by the way, is brand new. This is a 68 plate, the GTI badge there, and it's only got about 700 odd miles on the clock. Now, I hope you're a fan of these wheels if you want one of these cars, because again, this is the only option that you can have. I actually really like the rear 3/4 view. It's not a view that a lot of cars work in, but this, it shows you how kind of short and stubby it is. This huge piece of glass at the back really looks quite cool, especially when you get this little red accent, and these kind of funky rear lights that look like some sort of hieroglyphics. Now, on the inside, it's a mixture of love and hate for me. I really like the more upmarket feel that you get in here, because this is a VW product. So you've got 6-speed manual box, which is something specific to the GTI. Nice GTI steering wheel. You've got this kind of weird, funky red and black pattern kind of thing going on here. But I'm not a fan of the seats. Just generally not a fan of cloth seats, and I'm definitely not a fan of tartan cloth seats. Yes, I know it's a VW throwback retro type thing, but I just wish there was a leather option, and there isn't. This is the only option for the interior. Now, a fairly forward-thinking and clever design choice in here. You have a little holder for your phone. There's a little USB cable hidden behind it, and the idea is that rather than trying to sell you any sort of fancy upgraded sat-nav system or anything like that, you simply plug your phone in, and VW have gone, you know what, we know that your phone is going to be better than any sat-nav system we can put in here, so save you the money, save you the hassle, just plug your phone in. So that is quite a good idea, I think, from them. However, with a car like this, the most important thing, of course, is whether it's going to put a smile on your face. And that I'm genuinely worried about. I haven't driven this car yet, but the last time I drove a car with these kind of proportions was the 595 Abarth. And that's a car that I famously did not like. If you haven't seen that video, let's just say I'm not getting an invite to the Abarth Christmas party this year. But the V-dub may or may not be a very different proposition. So I'm going to get strapped in and we're going to hit the roads. Now, trying to find out more technical specifications about this car actually proved quite difficult. VW's own website is very, very vague when it comes to the differences between this car and a regular Up. Now, this is not an expensive car. This is £14,000 compared to, say, £10,000 for the cheapest of cheap Ups. On the plus side, on the interior, it does not feel like a £10,000 car in the same way that the Abarth 595 does. You can definitely tell that this has come from a higher quality parts bin. Now, fortunately, Michael has helped me out here with a few of the changes that they've made, and they do include what Q might refer to as some of the usual refinements. So you've got a different damper setup, you've got a very slightly wider track, and when I say slight, I mean about 8mm. The gearbox is different. This is the only car in the range to get a 6-speed box, and you have a steering rack from a Polo. Now, this little engine is actually kind of characterful. It's quite tuneful. Now, I believe it is pumping some artificial noise into the cabin, as is a trend for VWs these days. Now, on a road like this, which is something that this kind of car should be perfectly suited to, a couple of things really do take me by surprise. First off, this feels like a really big car. Now, that's either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it. Now, it's not a big car by modern standards, but it is a big car probably by Golf Mark 1 standards. What it is really is actually relatively tall, and you sit quite high. This is not something that I am generally a fan of, certainly not in sporty cars, but I know that people do like it, and for a city car, it's kind of desirable having this slightly elevated driving position. It's also somewhat stiffer than I expected it to be. There's no sports mode, there's no traction control button in here, there's no modes for the steering, of course there's no modes for the gearbox because it is operated by this. It is very much a back to basics car, and that's one of the reasons that it appealed to its owner. He's the sort of person that, much like myself, would usually be running around older, cheaper cars as a daily. He doesn't do that many miles, but with the issues that are surrounding us at the minute, like what's going to happen to diesel cars, rising fuel prices, insurance and tax on all the cars, he did the maths and said, look, what's the point? I may as well buy a cheap, newer car. It'll probably work out better for me financially. And he decided to go for this. Now, it is kind of punchy. These roads are a little bit slippery and greasy at the minute, so I'm going to exercise some degree of caution. It is relatively warm today at a balmy 14 degrees, but the road surface can be deceptively cold and slippy. But it certainly pulls along nicely. I'm in third gear at the minute. I've got a lot of mud and stuff on the road here. Now, this car is only available with a manual transmission. The other models in the Up range, much like the 595, are available with an automated manual transmission. Remember those from about 10 years ago, and if they're even remotely like what they used to be, I could never recommend one of those. I suspect it's packaging and cost constraints that stop them from putting a fancier gearbox in these cars. There's not an awful lot of room up there, but you know, the sort of 50 to 60 mile an hour pull, it does quite nicely, and it sounds all right. Now, certainly if you're looking at buying one of these as a young driver, you're going to think that it's brisk enough, and I think that's the kind of person that this really is aimed at. Someone that perhaps doesn't have maybe the budget for a Golf, and one of the issues with a Golf, especially a Golf GTI, is going to be insurance costs. And it's kind of a good looking thing. I mean, there's something nice to be said for being different. It's something that I celebrate on the channel all the time. Regular viewers will know that. And to have one of these, it's certainly going to stand out a little bit. In fact, I can't remember seeing one of these on the roads before today, and their popularity actually took VW by surprise as well. This car's owner ordered one the day after they were announced, and it took 4 or 5 months before he got his. A bit of Googling yesterday revealed an article from Autocar where they said that VW were having to rearrange the way they did production of these cars because demand had far outstripped the supply that they had planned for it. So, evidently, the formula is working. Now, the fact of the matter is that if you've got £14,000 to spend on a car these days, that doesn't really go as far as it used to, and, well, I think you kind of get everything you need in this. It's quick enough, it feels fairly upmarket, there's just about enough room to get people in the back for short journeys. I've got plenty of room here in the front. If I needed to, I could push myself forward a few inches if you had a tall friend in the back for a little bit. I wouldn't advocate it for long journeys, but that's fine. Now, the options list on these cars is fairly basic. As I said in the walk around, you've got only a few choices of colour. This white actually is a cost option. The only free colour is red, which does look okay. And VW, in their attempt to keep the car trendy, have put in some options that maybe appeal explicitly to the younger buyer, my favourite being a sticker that goes on the roof saying, "This side up." I personally would be interested in the panoramic sunroof because that would give the car a bit more of a fun kind of convertible vibe. And that at £710 is about the most expensive option that you could choose. Realistically, I don't think you'd ever be able to spec one of these at anything more than about 16 grand, and that's still somewhat cheaper than Fiesta ST money. And yes, the Fiesta is going to be in another league of performance, but it's also another class up in terms of size, running costs, etc, etc. This should not be compared with something like that. Really, its rivals are stuff like the 500, 595, and probably the Vauxhall Adam, which delivers similar performance and is perhaps a better sporty drive. It's a little lower, a little better in that respect, but also feels like a much cheaper car. If you've already got a Golf, and I can see the appeal of this car as maybe a second or even third car, you know, let's say you've already got something nice like your 911 or what have you, and you want a city car or a station car, there's definitely a lot to be said for this. In terms of fuel economy, it's pretty good, despite the fact that the car's only just about run in. It's getting over 50 to the gallon, that's UK figures, on the motorway, and over 40 to the gallon in town, or maybe a little bit less, depending on your mileage, your journeys, etc, etc. Now, they may not sound like amazing figures, but you have to remember those are real-world actual figures, and one of the issues that we're facing at the moment, and something that is changing, is the fact that until now, a lot of manufacturers have been putting out figures that are not false, they are certainly not lies, but they are based on a test which has produced somewhat unrealistic figures. Now, the new WLTP standards, they're doing a lot of stuff that I don't like. Give me back my sport buttons for my exhaust, please. But they're also doing things that are very, very handy and good for consumers in terms of generating more realistic fuel economy figures. I know from experience that people have bought the smaller twin-engined FCA products, stuff like the Mito Twin Air, those kind of things. They don't generate fuel economy figures that are actually as good as this. And basically, yeah, if you think you're going to get 80 to the gallon out of one of those cars, it's really not a guarantee. So a real world 50 something out of a petrol engined car with reasonable performance on tap is not bad. This car's got basic controls, it's got a sound system here. You can have a Beats sound system at a fairly modest 300 quid. This car was optioned without because you get a subwoofer that takes up a little bit of the underboot storage space, and Michael decided that he'd rather have a little bit more room in the boot rather than the subwoofer. Me, I'd go with the subwoofer, but it's personal preference. You got a fairly small screen down here that tells you everything you need to, and this car was optioned without climate control, but it still has air conditioning, and frankly, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do because, well, that's all you need. I really don't like climate control systems anyway. You could also have things like a reversing camera and so on and so forth, but honestly, with a car this small, I don't see the point. For about 3.5, 4 grand, this thing, it picks up strong. It gives up at about 5.5, but that's fine. It pulls me to a reasonable speed very easily and nicely, and actually quite impressed with the little thing. Now, other figures that may be of interest to you. Now, this is down power-wise in comparison to an Abarth 595, but it's also down weight-wise. Both of them are just over a ton, with an Abarth 595 tipping the scales in the real world, not on paper, at about 1,100 kilos. This is about 1,030, and in a car that weighs around a ton, a 70 kilo difference is actually pretty significant. Whilst it's not the best gearbox I've ever used, I wouldn't think to criticise it. Is it as good as in other VW products? No, maybe not quite as good as in the Golf, but the Golf is generally a gold standard in terms of gearboxes, so no complaints from me here. Heel and towing isn't coming particularly easily in this car. You give the pedal a good stab and, well, basically nothing happens, so that's kind of a downer if you're a sort of dedicated petrol head that wants to do that sort of thing, and that's maybe where a sports button would make a difference. The steering around town is very, very light, and I was a little bit worried when I sort of maneuvered out of the car park where we did our little walk around video. I thought that that was going to be something that let the side down, but actually when you get up to speed there is a little bit of information coming through it, and it certainly turns very, very nicely. One of my big issues with the 595 Abarth is the fact that you have this really odd non-linear steering. It just wants to fall over. That first movement is just really quite odd. It doesn't want to move, and then suddenly it just goes, whereas this does exactly what I want it to. I've never been in any doubt as to what the car is about to do, and the initial turn-in's actually quite pleasant when you consider it's based on a city car. It's not bad at all. And for roads like this, which are narrow and fraught with danger, it is the ideal kind of car. There's plenty of things I've driven down here where you're a little bit worried about what's going to be coming the other way. Now, visibility's not too bad actually. A lot of cars now there's a trend for huge B-pillars right here, which make your visibility pretty limited, and this is actually pretty good in that respect because the window goes fairly far back, so I can see quite far. And actually the throttle response is, when the car's on the boil, really quite good. If it was drier, I'd definitely be tempted to throw this car around a little bit more, but I'm not too worried about the back end wagging. You can feel the fact that you're high in the car. To me, that's what's slowing me down. In the Abarth, it was a waggy rear end. In this, it's simply that high. You get that kind of van-like sensation of tipping over. Now, I've no doubt that with more familiarity with the car, that you'd have greater confidence to kind of do fairly silly things with it. I've seen people driving these kind of cars around at speeds that are just unimaginable. But you know what? This thing's doing a pretty admirable job of pulling us down the road, and the brakes for a combined disc and drum setup, that's maybe one of my criticisms as well. Like, drum brakes and a GTI badge, 2018, it's a bit stingy, isn't it, VW? Come on, like, give it discs all round. I know it doesn't need them, but that's not the point. Like, let it have them anyway. I gave the Abarth a very, very hard time when I drove it, and I'm definitely a bigger fan of this car. Am I in love with it? No, not at all. Mostly because it's not the sort of car that I ever would be in love with. Now, in the interest of fairness, what would I say is another negative point about this car? Well, because the Abarth has been around for so long, the aftermarket support for it is massive, and for people buying this kind of car, your entry-level performance car, that personalization, that ability to modify and do what you want with the car, that's a really big element of ownership. I appreciate and understand that, and there's just not going to be that same level of support for this kind of vehicle. But if you're the sort of person who just wants to buy it and drive it and you're not worried about playing around with it, well, what's the problem? It's a nice car that goes well enough. I'm actually kind of having fun, to be honest, even on a greasy and damp road. And I can assure you that if I was driving my M3 down these roads right now in these conditions, I wouldn't be using the F word. I'd be using the other F word, but not the fun one. So there we have it, the Up GTI. Kind of surprising and different car from VW. Is it perfect? No, not at all, but then very few cars are. Is it something a little bit different from VW? Yeah, it kind of is, and I think we should really appreciate that, because that does not happen that often. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. Please comment below. Do you like these? Would you have one of these? What would you have instead? Please subscribe if you haven't already. It makes a big difference to me and the channel. We'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.